You're listening to SkillsWorld, the podcast. News, views, reviews and interviews in association with FE News.
Hello and welcome to SkillsWorld. I'm Tom Bewick and my regular podcast series is on the road this week, in Leicester to be precise, at the Federation of Awarding Bodies annual conference. Now, over the next few episodes, I'll be sharing some of the issues at that conference by interviewing some of the keynote speakers. Now, my first guest was the boss of the Association of Colleges for 8 years before taking on the world's first university chair in further education. Professor Martin Doel.
Hi.
Welcome to SkillsWorld.
Oh, nice to be here.
And what's it like being called Professor?
You know what? Imposter syndrome is applied to me all the way through the whole of my life, and this is just the next episode.
The next step. Well, let's just reflect a little bit on your illustrious life, Martin. Now, you, I think, described yourself in a profile interview I read as a kind of working class lad, joined the RAF, and you became an Air Commodore, and then after being involved all over the world in various RAF bases and activities, ended up taking up a big job at the Association of Colleges. How did you make that journey?
I think you'd take the next step and see where it takes you, see what works for you. And the big step actually was from the RAF into the AOC. And that came about, without too long a story, Tom, it reflecting on the three things that I was most proud of and enjoyed having done in the Air Force, and distilling what the qualities were. And those qualities were, there was something I believed in, that I worked with a diverse group of people who believed in the same thing, and that it brought responsibility and I could achieve something. So when I went looking for a job after the Royal Air Force, I looked for a job in an area where I would believe in what I was doing, with a group of people that were similarly believing in that, and where I could make a difference. That's what actually guided me through my RAF career and guided me into my career at the Association of Colleges.
And when you took that job at the Association of Colleges, I mean, you'd already, in a sense, built up quite a bit of knowledge about how the British education and training system, particularly the training and apprenticeship system, works. So you kind of had a view, didn't you, about how well it was working or not working?
Yeah, but it was a particular view from the experiences I'd had previously. As important going into it was actually, I think, understanding to some extent how government worked, how policy got made, how you could influence people to shape that policy, and how you would lead a team. So those are the generic things that when you added to some understanding of the world of further education, of skills. But my understanding when I went into it was partial. So I went in there listening as much as I was talking, I hope.
Absolutely. But you also came from a world, arguably, that, because it just has to be, it's the military, it's top down, it's command and control, people take orders. I'm sure that's changed a little bit in the 21st century from where we were many, many decades ago. But still, there are equally people who are critical of the skills system and say, well, that's a bit too top down as well and a bit command and control. And that sometimes makes life difficult, particularly for those at the front line. I mean, have you got any sympathy with that critique of the sort of technical education system?
I don't want to undermine the premise of your question.
Right.
I dispute how the military actually operates. If you're operating successfully in the military, particularly as you say in a modern military, you wouldn't achieve anything unless you told people why you wanted things done. And only in absolute extremists would you give direct orders. So first of all, you would explain why. Secondly, one of the things I found when I came, you might say perversely, into the further education sector, there was less robust debate about courses of action and what we were doing than I would find in the military.
Right.
The extent to which, if you've ever watched, I don't know, what the programme on the Red Arrows, how vicious the debate is around, did you fail? Why did we fail? How can we make this better? It was vicious insofar as the arguments were really direct, really revealing, but they weren't about the people. They were about the issue and making things better. So taking that into the new environment, I was slightly surprised about how sometimes people avoided the issue rather than confronting it in an honest and forthright manner and then responding and didn't trust one well enough in order to do that.
Well, there you go. That shows I haven't served in the military and therefore don't understand actually how a robust chain of command works. But on your point then about in a sense, managing failure or perceived failure or challenging poor practice then within the broader further education sector. I mean, you were at the helm of a representative organisation. I mean, I'm doing a similar job now here for the awarding bodies, and so there are competing interests, there are competing views, and you've got to sometimes follow, sometimes lead, more often than not have some pretty challenging conversations. I mean, looking back on that period when you were the AOC chief executive, what now would you perhaps do differently if you were looking back on that period in terms of taking the sector forward? Because I thought it was interesting in the profile interview I read of you. You talked about the FE world being neglected, but nevertheless it was at a pivotal moment in its history, just about really at the time when you took over the job at the AOC.
I don't want to answer that question with a cliche, but there is a cliche that's applied in the Royal Air Force, which is runway behind you doesn't matter. You can't go back and change it. So, again, reflection is important in order to learn what you do going forward. But I think sometimes reflection can be so introverted as to stop you taking the next step. It's a really great question. What would I have done differently at the AOC? You can go back and say I could have been more decisive at certain points. But
do you think all leaders would say that, though, looking back retrospectively? There's always that sense
because you have a greater sense of what happened and what you should have done in those circumstances. But what I am proud of, I think, is that we built a team that could get things done. So even if we didn't do as well as we might have done on the last question or debate, we were able to come back at it and have another go. And also, we were honest enough with ourselves to say that at some stages the team needed readjusting because the circumstances changed. And that was my own conclusion after 8.5 years. We needed to relaunch ourselves. I needed to relaunch myself. And was I up for another 4 years at least? Or was this the time to actually say, no, we've done a good job, we've got to a good place, there's an organisation I can hand on with some pride, and then move on to the next thing. So,
and it's fair to say, isn't it, Martin? I mean, your term of office anyway sort of coincided with a period under the previous government where there was obviously a lot of policy instability, but with that also came a lot of innovation and investment. And then sort of 2010 onwards, you see a retrenchment in some senses, abolition of various quangos. That's always a challenge for the further education sector because you have to rebuild those relationships. Obviously, as any new government's entitled to do, there's new ideas then about technical education. We've had the massive reforms to apprenticeships. We've had ongoing now the reforms to technical education, and FE's been put at the centre of the ambition around the study programme of T-levels over the coming years. So there's been a huge amount of instability, and how, perhaps now you're looking more afar. I mean, I wouldn't say in an ivory tower of University College London, because you're a professor, you're an academic, in the sense you've got a licence to some extent now to look through a different lens at the sector. But given your speech at the FAB conference, I mean, what are the kind of key things about where we are with the future of technical education and qualifications that you'd want to really ram home as a set of key points?
Yeah, the time at the AOC at times felt like making the world less worse. It was at the time of the greatest financial retrenchment in our nation's history since it's in the mid-1930s. Right. So in that context, as I say, there was an increase in resources, but if I walked away from it, I think we left at the point in 2015 with a spending review that stabilised the sector at a funding level that was too low, but with a focus on technical education and professional education that hadn't been there hitherto, which I have spoken about today, about that moment and what happens next in the reform programme. My reflection, I think, and one of the reflections I'd had from my time at the IOE, which has been a real pleasure and an honour to be able to sit back and think about what's gone before and what will come next, is that any reform programme, and I think we are like to be embarked on a significant extension of the reform programme with technical and further education very much to the fore, will either dissolve or lose its way if the fundamentals aren't attended to first. We have a great tendency in this country, it's a strength about pragmatism and getting on and getting things done, But that can dissolve into take the next step, see where that takes you, then take the next step, and end up in a place where you look back and say, how did we end up here? So I think there will be money, there will be attention on further education in the forthcoming years and on technical and professional education. So money, interestingly, as I said this morning, I don't think is my particular worry in the intermediate or the medium-term future.
And is that because there's £500 million or so already assigned to T-levels? So is that the big payday then for FE colleges?
I think that's an evidence of good intent, but I think it's more about the external circumstances which will drive things here. It's about the shape of the modern economy, that there's an acceptance that a market can't regulate itself. Equally, I would argue there needs to be an acceptance you can't return to a controlled economy. So there's going to need to be a structured economy. And within that structured economy, I think there's going to be a more interventionist approach to how we grow skills in response to external circumstances like Brexit, about the change from an economy which is heavily based on fixed assets to one which is going to be based on hidden or intangible assets, where knowledge and skills are going to be more important. Those are external drivers will begin, and mismatches in places between wealth and areas which are very narrowly divided in distance terms, but in terms of outcomes, much more. Further education is in the place which is potentially able to solve those issues. So I think the finance and attention will continue, but what will transfer this into a rational and logical progressive movement forward, and one that turns a moment into a movement, will be about understanding the fundamental questions that need to be asked about what further education is going to be asked to do and what qualifications are going to be asked to do. And that's what I've tried to talk about this morning.
And as you say, those fundamental questions about where next for FE is essentially being asked within the context of what commentators call the fourth industrial revolution, the notion of by 2040, 35% of jobs could potentially be exposed to abolition via automation, via digital, artificial intelligence, and just changes in technology. It's not the first time, of course, we've had those sort of scenarios, and going back decades of essentially the economy destroying jobs faster at a rate faster than it's creating them. So I think one's always got to look at with a degree of healthy scepticism at some of those estimates, but still it does sort of posit, doesn't it, a big strategic challenge for the FE sector vis-a-vis, how does it run with a lot of those bigger consumer, technological, geopolitical changes, whilst at the same time respond to what some might see as quite a rigid view of, for example, technical levels. There'll only be 24. It's only one awarding body or one licensed awarding body structure per T-levels. I think for people that are in the detail of some of these big fourth industrial revolution changes, it just seems counterintuitive to have such an interventionist top-down approach, and whether, actually the trick here is to somehow empower the front line and get the colleges themselves to be more masters of their own destiny, but whilst accepting they've got to work within some kind of national framework. I mean, this
is exactly what I'm talking about, a post-market economy. The return to the 1960s about close control of industry, outputs, productivity and training won't survive a modern economy that will move as quickly as it will. There will be a potential, I think, in devolution for closer control. But if local authorities begin to take, or mayors seek to exercise very close control, they'll be just precisely wrong about what they're asking colleges to do. Right. So I think you do need to liberate innovation and enterprise at the point of delivery. That said, though, I think there needs to be some structure around that, and how you perform or develop structures that are both permissive of that enterprise, but actually allow for a sense of direction to be maintained, is where I think we need to be applying effort. And one of the things I've talked about is how you can have a system which is both collaborative and competitive. And what would that look like, and what sort of behaviours would it require of providers and all the players within it, and how would government incentivise both collaboration and competition within a system? So those are the type of fundamental questions I think we need to wrestle with. in order to give it a sense of direction as things move forward. That really is my forthcoming lecture, which I mentioned. You have to dress it up in academic terminology. It's called The Future of Further Education, Dichotomies, Dualisms and Dialectics. It's saying there appear to be a series of tensions in the future, but actually they're always going to be there. It's between local and national, between first choice and second chance. And it's always going to fall between the two of them somewhere.
Absolutely.
But how you work out your way through this, about the settlement you have between the two extremes, will characterise a successful or not successful reform programme.
Absolutely, and no doubt the debate will rumble on about exactly what that settlement should be. And as we know with the electoral cycle, inevitably politicians and policymakers will also come in with a view on what that direction of travel is. As ever, Martin, it's a pleasure to talk to you about these issues. I wish we had longer on the podcast today to go into even more detail on some of the really fundamental questions which you've raised. But just to say to those that are listening, if you want to download a copy of Martin's presentation, please just visit the Federation of Awarding Bodies website at awarding.org.uk, where you'll be able to download all of the presentations and speeches from FAB 2019. Just leaves me to say thank you, Professor Martin Doel, for joining us.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
And tune in next time. Thank you.
Sign up to SkillsWorld at www.fenews.co.uk.